Blood for the Blood God and Skulls for the Skull Throne, let's talk through the strongest and weakest World Eaters units in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking World Eaters, and in this video I thought we'd do a tier list for unit power for the faction, going through each unit in turn, roughly how strong I'd rank them and why. Currently at the moment, the World Eaters do seem to be having a fairly good time of it in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. 10th edition didn't really start too great for them, with a lot of units just being a bit overcosted, but with some small points adjustments they really seem to be doing rather well. Often seen doing a rather brutal melee rush with a lot of scout moves, hitting the enemy very hard right from turn 1. Their win rates are around about 51% at big tournaments and have had plenty of tournament wins over the past few months. In this video I thought we'd talk through some of the strongest World Eaters options out there, with their units roughly sorted into 5 tiers of strength, and for a little bit more nuance I decided to split tier 2 into an upper and lower as well. As always with these tier lists in Warhammer 40k, they are a bit arbitrary. Some things could be ranked a bit higher or lower depending on your given army or context, and how you particularly like to play the faction. This one's made with a combination of community polling, units commonly played in high placing lists, and my own opinions. I'm sure you'd get subtle differences in opinions if done by different players. Let's jump straight on into it though, and first up we have tier 5. Unfortunately I've chosen to rank the poor Helldrake all on its lonesome down here. 210 points for an Angry Cornate aircraft, a fast moving hover flyer that has anti-fly 2+ on its small amount of melee attacks, and the World Eaters version does a sort of flyby move where it can inflict D3 mortal wounds on something it moves over. This thing is just spectacularly overcosted unfortunately. Games Workshop don't really seem to be being very kind to flyers or aircraft in 10th edition so far. Somehow this one seems to be even costlier and less useful than the other Chaos versions, never mind the fact that World Eaters in general don't seem to have too much issue with rushing the enemy often turn 1, and that niche doesn't really feel particularly stand out for the Helldrake either. Moving onwards, and next we've got tier 4. These are the units that I'd rate as kind of overshadowed within the index, fairly rarely appearing in competitive lists, and I feel in general for World Eaters there are better choices out there. First up, I've chosen to put the Winged Demon Prince here, which I think feels inferior to the On Foot Demon Prince in this index. This guy grants a battle shock against an enemy unit each turn, and gets to nominate one chosen target for 4 rerolls in melee against them, but overall his damage output just isn't really all that exciting with Demon Prince class melee. When he could be taking units of 8 bound for really quite a lot cheaper than him, his damage output kind of pales in comparison. Could be an interesting enough choice for most of the enhancements like the Berserker Glaive, half damage Brazen Ire or Favourite of Khorne, but I feel like if you're probably taking those, I'd rather take the On Foot Demon Prince out of the two due to his better buffs. Next up I've chosen to rank the World Eaters Hellbrute down here as well. 140 points for a fairly standard Hellbrute stat line, one big heavy weapon, maybe something like a twin las cannon, plus some damage 3 melee. This guy does have a pretty interesting special rule to be fair. Each time he's attacked he gets to either shoot or fight, and in the right circumstances that could be a really big deal, could potentially allow you to kill something out of sequence in the enemy turn. Unfortunately though, despite really quite a good special rule, his raw numbers just aren't very strong at all and he only moves 6 inches, so he usually tends to get passed up in competitive lists. Despite that, I'd rank him towards the upper end of this tier. I could have been persuaded to put him in tier 3 if I was feeling generous. That special rule is rather godly, but his raw stat line is pretty lacking and he's very slow moving. Next up we've got the World Eaters Predator tanks, 130 points either for the Destructor with its autocannons and extra AP against infantry, or the Annihilator with its las cannons and handy rerolls against monsters or vehicles. Both of these I'd rate as just kind of fine for their damage output against their intended targets. Not really going to be giving too much harm to a list if you take some of these along for a bit of pinpoint firepower, but maybe just don't really feel like they're playing into the strengths of the faction very much. And compared with say the Chaos Space Marine version of these that can get the Dark Packs for some big damage boost, they do feel a bit tame. Nothing really too wrong with them though. I'd probably go for the Annihilator over the Destructor myself for a bit of focused long-ranged anti-tank, though they're both pretty useful. Finally for this tier we have the Defiler at 190 points. It's usable enough as a generalist, both with some guns and some big hitting melee that's good against heavies. It can use tank shock to fairly good effect with that high strength. It does have quite a big annoying profile that might be hard to move around terrain, isn't super fast, and has a kind of lackluster special rule though. Just in general, like other Chaos Space Marine Defilers out there, I'd rank this guy as fairly tame. I've really not seen many people running Defilers on the table compared with other choices. Next up, moving upwards to Tier 3, these are units I'd rate a bit more interesting within the Codex, but for really competitive optimized lists, all of these are still kind of rarely taken, or tend to be in smaller numbers in a bit more of a supporting role. First up, the Demon Prince on foot is 200 points. He gets the same melee as the winged one and gets toughness 10 compared with the winged version, though is obviously a bit slower. His buffs that he provides I think are a bit more interesting though. He gives an aura of a 4+ invulnerable save to nearby infantry. Could be interesting for jackals or corn berserkers slogging up towards objectives, and he himself hits a bit harder on the charge with devastating wounds, making his melee usually better than the winged one unless the winged one gets into its specific marked targets that it picked pre-game. Again, with a big scary model, it could be interesting for just about any of the enhancements. The Helm of Brazen Iron might be the most interesting for him with the half damage thing, as that actually makes him kind of tough to take out. Otherwise, the Berserker Glaive could be okay, though most people tend to want that on a Master of Executions, or it could be another model that could bear Favored of Khorne, which people often want in the army, though that one often tends to get given to a much cheaper Lord on Juggernaut. I still think he's interesting enough though, maybe towards the top end of this tier, for a big tough scary character with an interesting buff that can take enhancements. Next up, for 480 points, is the Khorne Lord of Skulls. Big chunky stats with 24 wounds, toughness 13, and a 5+ invulnerable save. Really big firepower that's capable of cracking enemy armor, and a big melee threat that can make good use of Blessings of Khorne and any stratagems that can target him. This guy's just a lot to deal with, could be a big tough focal point for an army, and unless the opponent has got a serious amount of anti-tank firepower, it's almost certainly going to cause them some big problems. Still though, that is a lot of points to be investing in any one model, perhaps particularly so in the context of most World Eaters lists wanting to run Angron these days, who already eats up a big chunk of points. Overall, I'd say that they're usable, but rarely going to appear in hyper-optimized lists. Next up, we've got the World Eaters Mauler Fiend, 155 points for a dedicated melee Mauler vehicle, high strength attacks that can make good use of tank shock like the Defiler. The World Eaters version seems to be particularly good at stiffing out injured enemies, having a +2 to charge against those and a +1 to hit in melee when it gets there. Again, I'd say for the threat that this one brings, it's kind of fine. It'll move up, be able to tank a bit of damage and then hit something very hard. Again, it does seem that more people are choosing to use 8-bound for this role though. Their damage output is kind of spectacular, they interact better with terrain, and can make use of a few more synergies within the index. Certainly doesn't feel like the worst choice in the world though, for an extra dedicated melee rush vehicle to draw enemy firepower and cause problems if they don't choose to target it. Next up, for 240 points, is the World Eater's Land Raider. This can deliver infantry units into melee at a pretty good range. As with other Land Raiders, it's fairly tough with 16 wounds, a 2+ save and toughness 12, and it brings some big las cannons to bear as well to crack enemy armor at range. Perhaps the biggest problem for the World Eater's Land Raider is that most of the units just don't really need it. For the Terminators, they're not considered the strongest choice right now given their points cost, plus you can't really fit that many in there. 8-bound are fast enough that they don't really need a transport, particularly not with Blessings of Khorne on offer, 4+2 to move and advance and charge, and Khorne Berserkers maybe aren't quite threatening enough to really need a Land Raider to jump out of. They seem to do absolutely fine with Rhinos, solving their transport problem for much lesser a cost, and maybe being a bit more appropriate for them as a unit that wants to be on the midfield objectives if they can. Between all that, a lot of lists seem to think that a Land Raider just isn't really worth the investment for the premium melee delivery. I feel like it's by no means a really bad choice. You could certainly have a big scary Berserker unit with Kharn in it perhaps, zooming up the board and hitting something very hard indeed. Feels like that could maybe be one of the stronger uses for it. Next up, I thought I might just briefly mention allies. I know War Dog Brigands aren't World Eaters, but I feel like they're perhaps worth mentioning as a competitive unit for the army, perhaps being one of the most interesting gun turrets they can access. 160 points for a chain gun with AP -2 if it targets the closest thing, plus a great big Demon Breath Spear with Melter 4, and some bonus stubble shots on top. Besides that, it's really quite fast for gaining lines of sight on things that it needs to, and actually has good objective control as well. Could be interesting to hold down a home field point. I feel like if you want World Eaters fire support, the War Dogs are kind of interesting to ally in at the moment. Definitely by no means mandatory, but I feel like these guys compete with and perhaps outclass a bit the actual World Eaters firepower units within the index. Next up, we've got the World Eaters Terminator Squad, 190 points for 5 of them, or 380 for 10. They're generally going to be competing with the Khorne Berserkers and the 8-bound units for the Premier World Eaters damage dealers. Their unique selling points are really quite tanky for the cost, given their big Terminator plate and their invulnerable saves. They've got built-in deep strike so they can rapid ingress, and they come with a bit of shooting on top of their melee attacks, which, while maybe not quite as standout as 8-bound, still are really quite punchy. Their special rule is a little bit situational though. It gives them damage boosts as the squad takes casualties. It does give them a +1 to wound when they're below half strength if they're still surviving. At the moment, I would say that relative to the other options, the World Eaters Terminators are just a bit on the overcosted side. The primary damage dealers, the 8-bound, seem to be ascendant there. They're not strong enough to be taken competitively for the elite infantry type role, and for other things, Khorne Berserkers have better character access and better objective support rules, and have more things to sell them as an alternative. Maybe not the worst that there's more emphasis on the truly World Eaters unique sculpts. I do feel like these guys could afford to come down a bit to have a bit more of a credible argument to bring them over the rest. Next up, for 65 points, we have Chaos Spawn coming in units of 2. These guys do have the advantage of being the single cheapest unit in the index. If you just wanted super cheap squads to do, say, secondary objectives or babysit a primary unit, then they can do that, though I feel like they are really quite competing with the Jackals there, which for 5 points do give you some big advantages. Otherwise, beyond that, they do have some threat of their own. They have a 5+ feel no pain and will basically regenerate wounds up to full health, as they get to do that in both command phases if they're injured but not killed. I do have a bit of melee threat with a bunch of strength 6 and damage 2 attacks that only hit on a 4+. In general, despite that though, I think if I were taking Chaos Spawn, I'd probably be tempted to take Jackals instead at the moment. Their extra objective control, sticky objectives, and icon are all really big advantages when they're doing objective type things. And even if the Spawn has some slightly chunkier stats, I'm not sure that's enough of a selling point with 5 points less. Finally, for the units that have chosen to rank in Tier 3, we have the World Eaters Forge Fiend, 170 points, and this guy brings Mass Strength 10, AP 3 and Damage 3 shots with the Blast keyword, so it means that you could rack up a whole load more hits against anything with big infantry units. It stands out good damage against Terminators, strong enough to be able to hurt light armor quite well, and the World Eaters 1 can hand out battle shock tests for infantry units, though I would say that that's not really the strongest special rule out there. Again, like the World Eaters Predators, these guys really don't like to be compared against the ones from Codex Chaos Space Marines, where they can take things like the Mark of Nurgle with Dark Pacts for a massive amount of sustained hits. Plus, the special rule isn't as good as the Codex Chaos Space Marine one, with the option to overheat for devastating wounds. Overall, I'd say it's an interesting enough gun turret if you specifically want this sort of firepower, but not enormously strong for the points. I'd probably rank it towards the bottom of this tier if anything. It could have been a tier 4 unit if I was feeling a bit less generous. Moving onwards and upwards though, and in tier 2 we get to the units that I consider really quite strong for the World Eaters at the moment. Kind of appropriately, this is where the vast majority of their unique sculpts are found. I decided to divide this one into a slightly lower half and a slightly upper half, though all of these units do crop up in competitive army lists. First up, we've got the World Eaters Lord on Juggernaut for 100 points. This guy hits with a whole bunch of AP1 damage 2 attacks, can bully lighter infantry units, plus gets some mortal wound impact hits, and this guy is perhaps most commonly used in competitive lists as a solo bearer for the Favour of Khorne enhancement, the one that allows you to reroll Blessings dice. That enhancement is powerful enough for most people to want to have it in a list, and the Lord on Juggernaut seems to be the right balance of at least fairly sturdy, but not quite high investment enough to be too worried about him just being sat at the back and keeping safe for a turn or two before venturing forward to skirmish with the enemy. I guess the other alternatives for that would be a Master of Executions or a Demon Prince. For the Demon Princes, I feel like you'd want to try and get them stuck in given how many points they cost though. Otherwise though, I would say that his damage output and his buffing rules aren't really all that stand out for the cost. AP1 does hurt his attacks, and his special rule is to allow rerolls to advance, charge, and Blessings of Khorne for his lead units, which is okay but not super standout. The mounted keyword does have the possibility to cause problems with 8-bound or berserkers as well. He needs to go round terrain rather than just straight through. Even so though, for a caddy for the Favour of Khorne and still being able to do some decent countercharge if lighter enemy units get too close, he does make his way into lots of competitive lists. I could probably have ranked him in the upper half and still been happy with that placement as well. Next up, we have the heart of the army in the Khorne Berserkers, 100 points for 5 or 200 for 10. The Foot Troopers of Khorne bring Objective Control 2 to the table, a whole bunch of Strength 5 or 6 volume attacks, plus Strength 8 Eviscerators, and are quite nice to have on an objective with their Icon of Khorne allowing them to reroll their Blessings dice. Otherwise, their Blood Surge rule is maybe a little bit situational, but in the right situation it could be quite big. Potentially means that your opponent can't really afford to park a unit right next to them and then shoot some of them dead for fear of just winding up in combat and not being able to kill the rest of them with shooting. Overall, I'd say their damage and defense are just kind of okay. Their objective rules are alright, though I feel like perhaps the best thing that sells them tends to be the characters, particularly the World Eater's Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive that we'll get onto. Kyle the Betrayer is really quite punchy as well, and could be potentially joining them unless he wants to just go off on his own. And they work quite nicely with Rhinos being able to drive up onto midfield objectives and then have a whole load of angry guys get out if their ride's shot out from under them. Their individual units are a little bit cheaper than 8 bound, which maybe helps for unit trading as well, and they can still skirmish very nicely with any cheaper objective holders the enemy sends out to the midfield. In general, they don't tend to be relied on as the core damage dealers of the army though they certainly can chip away at things. They often seem to be fielded in a bit more of a support role to the 8 bound doing the heavy lifting these days, in kind of small numbers and often with rhinos and characters, but still very much a presence in most competitive lists. Maybe not loads to say about the Rhino here. It's 75 points and it gets Khorne Berserkers to the midfield safely. Nice and tough for the cost, fairly fast, a little bit of anti-infantry firepower and self-repair. When the Berserkers have jumped out of it, maybe to go charging onto the midfield or killing enemy lighter units, it can then be a distraction doing nuisance charges or sitting on objectives to put a bit more pressure on them. A nice cheap and expendable unit for the cost. Generally, if using Khorne Berserkers, I'd be quite tempted to field them in Rhinos. Next up, we've got the Jackals, 70 points for 10 of them, or 140 for 20. These guys are basically the World Eaters versions of Cultists, only objective control 1, but they have one big advantage over the Khorne Berserkers in that they get that sticky objectives rule. Pretty nice to have that on the home field objective from turn 1, so even if you move away from it, then it remains under your control until the opponent can take it. They also get a Cornate icon to allow some rerolls of Blessings dice, and that's not quite nice at cheap for 70 points. And besides Spawn, as mentioned, they're one of the cheapest units in the index, so if you need grunts to do secondaries, then they're a pretty reasonable choice. For being a fairly cheap unit, their melee also really isn't too bad. They certainly bully enemy cultists and any of their equivalents with a whole bunch of strength 4 attacks with sustained hits on the charge, plus they're dishonored to punch a little bit harder. Overall, I'd generally be tempted to take these in small numbers in a World Eaters list, the main draw being the sticky objectives rule and the icon blessing reroll. For the upper half of the things that I've chosen to rank in tier 2, we have the Exalted 8 bounds, 150 points for 3 of them or 300 for 6. These guys are just absolutely brutal shock troopers, fully worthy of Khorne and the World Eaters. They move pretty quickly at 9 inches with the infantry keyword. They have utterly brutal strength 14, AP 3 and damage 2 melee, or they can strike with the eviscerators if it makes more sense. They could deep strike if you wanted a rapid ingress threat. That could be an interesting way of getting maybe a small squad of 3 of them into the fight turn 2. And when they do get to combat, if they haven't killed everything that they were fighting against, they've got the chance of stopping the enemy from falling back, which could be kind of fatal if the opponent fails a battle shock test at the wrong time, if you've consolidated into a couple of things in an enemy gun line. Allowing these guys to hide in melee could be absolutely massive. They also feel like perhaps the best unit for Lord Invocatus to allow to scout forward into the midfield. He'll allow them to move up 6 inches, and then with their 9-inch move plus the Blessings of Khorne bonuses, they can easily be making first turn charges, and these guys are exactly not the sort of thing you want to have breaking things down in your lines turn 1. Overall pretty terrifying. Perhaps their main weakness is their durability, which is still kind of low despite a 6+ feel no pain and toughness 6. At 50 points per model, they're still fairly easy to kill when they're focused. Talking of that scout move, we've got Lord Invocatus at 140 points. He has pretty dangerous melee with a whole bunch of attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 with devastating wounds. Really quite a lot punchier than the standard Juggernaut Lord, though he does cost more. He can scout forward 6 inches and allow 2 other infantry units to do so as well. Exalted 8 bound are really quite big with that. Perhaps some foot slogging Khorne Berserkers could be another potential target. Regular 8 bound can do it already. With that, and then those Blessings of Khorne buffs for +2 movement and advance and charge, that means that you could have really quite a lot of World Eaters charging the opponent turn 1. Angron could do it just with his base movement, and then you could have multiple squads of 8-bound as well. If the opponent has deployed a bit too far forward, or they haven't been able to screen things with infiltrators, he's okay in his own right as another smaller threat to be moving forward, though I feel like his biggest advantage is that scout move. Again, he feels like one of the units that doesn't necessarily need to be leading a unit as well. His buff to fallback, shoot and charge is kind of mediocre. Could be handy in the right circumstances if the opponent doesn't manage to deal enough damage to the unit he's leading, but he does feel like a unit that's absolutely fine to run alone and doesn't have to join a unit if he doesn't want to. Next up, there's Khan the Betrayer for 80 points. Again, he's another unit that is commonly chosen just to run all by himself, just as really quite a cheap individual character that can massively maul something in combat. He has 9 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 3 on the charge. Very nice for 80 points, and could make further use of blessings or that +1 to wound stratagem if he does want to hit harder. If he is leading a unit though, then he makes his own damage and his squad's damage really quite a lot more dangerous. You get to reroll 1s to hit and 1s to wound. Overall, that's a 35% damage increase, which is quite a lot. Though being the Betrayer and a bit blood mad, he does have the chance to kill some friends if there's no foes to smash and he fail a battle shock test. In general, I'd say that's a price worth paying to bring him along though. Overall, just really quite cheap and really quite fighty, hard to go wrong. Finally for this tier, we've got the regular 8-bound, 135 points for 3 of them, or 270 for 6. These guys aren't quite as standout as the Exalted 8-bound at bringing down tanks and vehicles, but will still stack some good damage on them and make an absolutely massive mess of anything smaller than that. They'll really go through medium and heavy infantry with gusto. Their main advantage is getting a scout innately. They don't need Lord Invocators to lead them to do that, and they can move forward into the midfield and threaten early charges. They also bring an aura of reroll 1s to wound, and that gets better against anything that's below half strength, potentially allowing them to really quite easily finish off damage things if they can get their eviscerators on them. Overall really quite scary, maybe not as truly apocalyptic damage as the Exalted 8-bound, but they are a bit cheaper. In general, most World Eaters competitive lists do build around a solid core of 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound as their core damage dealers for the army, besides the Red Angel himself. Speaking of which, moving onwards and upwards into Tier 1, here we have what I consider the ultimate favourite of Khorne within Index World Eaters right now. I have chosen to rank Angron and the World Eaters Master of Executions here. Angron's a big 415 points, and he charges out like a red meteor heading towards the enemy army, a 14-inch movement, and again a good candidate for those turn 1 blessings. A 16-inch movement and advance and charge should hopefully have him hitting home against the enemy army turn 1, unless they've deployed really quite far back. When he gets there, he either has the chance of 9 attacks at strength 17, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 2, or 17 at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 2, good for clearing out Space Marines there. It's not really a threat that your opponent can afford to ignore, it's going to break something significant every turn until he's dealt with. And if he does happen to be able to be fighting alongside other World Eaters units, he gets a choice of 3 aura buffs. The reroll hits one is the one that helps him the most, and that's probably the one that I'd go for. Then when he's charging his way forward, he is likely to take up the majority of the enemy's attention and gunfire. When he's slain though, he gets that enormous chance to revive. If he can muster a 666 on the Blessings of Khorne dice, he can be reborn in blood, added back into strategic reserve at full health, deep striking and hopefully making a charge from there. If that happens at least fairly early in the game, it could be absolutely game changing or game winning. Your opponent usually can't afford to have 400 points worth of very dangerous and kind of hard to kill model just turn up again. The chance really isn't guaranteed, even with the favourite of Khorne plus rerolls from the Berserker icons. The chance does go up really quite significantly. With Favourite of Khorne plus Berserker icon rerolls, I think it gets towards the region of around 40 to 50%. There's really quite a big chance of him coming back and wrecking face. Just with his raw might and that potential game-winning possibility, it does seem that Angron is considered good enough to be run in just about every competitive World Eaters list, pretty much auto-include for most people. Otherwise though, perhaps the other model that is one of the most auto-include models out there is the World Eater Master of Executions. He's 80 points and is a fighty character model that gives his Khorne Berserker charges the Fights First ability, which can be really quite handy to have when they're in the midfield, meaning that they're a hard unit to charge as they'll get to slap the enemy first. Pretty good for a unit that's trying to defend objectives. On the charge, his base melee gets you 6 attacks at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2, with precision, devastating wounds, and rerolling all hit and wound rolls versus any character units, not just characters themselves, any squad that has a character in, full stop. That is kind of fine and really quite threatening, though the Berserker Glaive that seems to be the auto-include on him takes him to the next level for 25 points. That one gives him +1 attack and +1 damage at base, or when he makes a charge move it's plus D3 attacks, so on average 8, and D3 extra damage. So again, on average that'd be 8 attacks, damage 4, and with those enormous rerolls that could make him just a monstrously threatening model on a unit that fights first. Overall, pretty massive value of just north of 100 points for him plus the Berserker Glaive. He's pretty much a staple in World Eater's list, usually jumping out of a Rhino, often with 5 Khorne Berserkers, and taking the heads of enemy champions in the midfield. So anyway, with the Red Angel himself talked about, that brings us to the end of this World Eaters tier list. Let me know your thoughts on the units that have been working for you, or you've seen run to good effect down in the comments below. Happy to hear any thoughts as to anything that you might have ranked higher or lower yourself as well. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.